Okay, so we're going to get started. So, good morning, everyone. I'm Melissa Ludwig. I'm the chair of the NACD Philadelphia chapter, and we want to thank you all for joining us this morning on a joint program with our New England partners on hot topics for the upcoming Proxy season, which we've presented. Ellen and I were just comparing notes about 5 years in a row, and as you know, we produce two programs. One is this one about the hot topics for the upcoming, and then in September, join us for our What Happened and What's Next. So before we get started, we would like to begin really with acknowledging the devastation that's happening in California and also to some of our NACD partners. So we would like to make sure that everybody is keeping them in their prayers and their thoughts, and certainly any of the donations that you send to the West Coast will be sorely needed. So thank you so much. So with that, before we get started, we have a couple of things, which of course are the housekeeping, and that is that we would love everyone to be on mute. We have well over 162, almost 200 folks joining us this morning that will be in and out. So please make sure that you put yourself on mute. Please do not wait. Put your questions into the chat box. We will weave them into the session and/or at the conclusion of the session. We have tremendous amount of material to get forward, to go through, so we'll get started in 1 second. For those of you that have to receive credits, please make sure that you have your full name registered, and we will make sure that we take care of that. And finally, for the panelists and the moderators' statements, we want to make sure that they are that they are their own and not the companies with which they work. And as you know, we have a tremendous sponsor help today. We really want to thank you all because it's with you and your support that fulfills our mission, which is delivering all of you first-class, customer-centric, local programming, and peer-to-peer sharing of insights, which we do throughout the year. So today, we have the pleasure of highlighting two very special premier partners, KPMG and Pay Governance, who have continued to support our mission of excellence in the boardroom. We want to thank you all for your support, and most importantly for today's speakers, Keith, Steve, Stephen, and Brianna. Thank you so much. And it is now my pleasure to introduce today's moderator, who needs really no introduction, and that's our own Gloria Larson. Gloria is a respected lawyer, a public policy expert, Boston business leader, and former Bentley University president. And I'd like to say our dear partner. So thank you, Gloria, for taking this on and continuing to be the great partner that you are. And I'm going to turn it right over to you.
Thanks so much, Melissa. And I'm so excited to join everyone who's with us as such a great, expansive audience. So let me just really quickly, you've got their bios, but I want to really quickly give you the headlines for each of our participants, our panelists today. Steve Barth is a partner at Foley Lardner with over 40 years of corporate governance experience. Glad you could join us, Steve.
Thanks,
Stephen
Lori.
Brown, Managing Director and Senior Advisor of KPMG's Board Leadership Center. Brianna Castro is Vice President of U.S. Research at Glass Lewis and heads the research team responsible for public company analysis and voting recommendations. And Keith Jessen, a partner at Pay Governance with 17 years of executive compensation consulting experience. So wide-ranging experience, highly knowledgeable. Welcome to you all, and let's get started. I have just a couple of words of introductory comments to make, and I'll start with the recap of last year, the 24 Proxy season that was mentioned by Melissa. PwC's Governance Insight Center does an analysis every year, and then they do a recap. And while they found no single trend to explain the rise in support for companies and directors last year, one element they felt was worth singling out. That was the breadth and quality of corporate disclosures, which PwC believes may be contributing to some of the voting that was cast last year, as well as catching up finally with investor expectations. Undoubtedly, there are many factors involved with voting each proxy season, but shareholder support for environmental and social proposals, both pro and anti-ESG, dropped. Support for say on pay reached its highest level in 5 years. And significantly, average director support rose across both the Russell 3000 and S&P 500 following several years of decline. So what can we expect this year? Well, not surprisingly, a new deregulatory-minded Trump SEC and the impacts that might bring to the 2025 proxy season is the wild card that tops the list. Our panelists are prepared to dive into this, as well as myriad other hot topics, and we'll conclude with expectations for another year of heightened activist activity following the activity that we saw particularly between third and fourth quarters last year. It'll be bolstered by continued equity market strength and predictions of significantly increased M&A activity supported by a much more deal-friendly Trump administration. So with that, as you can imagine, let's get started. Let's jump in with the new Trump SEC. And Steve, I think you've been chomping at the bit to talk about this. You and I've had a little bit of a preview of where this conversation could go, but I know you've given a lot of thought to the impacts, both in sort of a broader global sense. I'd love to start with sort of, the classic, what do you think the first 90 to 180 days are going to bring us with the new Trump SEC? And maybe just take a step back and give us what you think will be sort of the overarching regulatory philosophy and what's going to happen to staffing, and will there be DOGE impacts and those types of overarching shifts. And then we can jump in with you and our other panelists to talk a little bit about specific impacts in areas of key shareholder interests.
Sure. Thanks, Gloria, and good morning to everybody. Let me first add my thoughts and prayers as well to everyone in Los Angeles. We have an office there, and we have partners who have been displaced, and it's really horrific. So anyways, moving on from that, boy, what a difference next week will make at the SEC. There will be wholesale changes, as many of you know. We have the chair, Gary Gensler, stepping down on Monday. We have one of the Democratic commissioners, Jamie Lizarraga, who's stepping down tomorrow. Corporate Fin Director leaving, Chief Accountant leaving. We should see a massive exit of SEC personnel, especially at the higher levels. Obviously, a very different priority set with the new SEC chairman, Paul Atkins, coming in. Not yet confirmed. That probably will take 60-ish days, probably into April before Chair Atkins is confirmed. And oh, by the way, the two continuing SEC commissioners, Hester Pierce and Mark Ureta, both Republican commissioners, have previously advised Paul Atkins on various policy matters. So talk about being besties. These three will be BFFs and create what a number of commentators have said is the most powerful single policy SEC that we have seen in many, many years. So we are going to see an entirely new regulatory philosophy. We are going to see, obviously, a very different staff level at the SEC, especially at the upper levels, with right to work and the DOGE implications, and maybe even the combination of PCAOB into the SEC in the coming years. This is going to be a dramatically different regulatory agency.
Thank you. That's terrific. So now I know everybody's interested to say, okay, so what's going to happen to the rules that are already in existence, stayed on the ledger to move forward with quickly? If the Biden administration had become the Harris administration. So let's start with the cyber rule, which involves what has been a highly, highly unpopular, I know, I could speak from personal board experience, incident reporting mandate, the 4-day business day rule with material breach as soon as you figure out that it's material. It's been a problem. So what do you think is going to happen overall? And then perhaps you could go into climate currently on hold, but it's going to be, neck deep, not just knee deep, in some new regulatory standardization with respect to climate metrics.
So let me start with the easier one, and that's the climate rule. Say goodbye. That isn't going to happen. So that's pretty easy, right? So all the work that all of you have done to get ready for it, well, that was great. It was helpful, right? And I think vestiges of, voluntary disclosure here will continue to be important. Questionable whether climate-related disclosures are going to be important to institutional investors on a go-forward basis. Maybe, maybe not. Obviously, continues to be important to customers and other constituencies, and to many of those who have sustainability reports that are separate from your SEC reporting. I suspect those will continue to be robust. But as far as SEC regulatory disclosures, goodbye. Now, the harder issue is what happens to the cyber rules, which many would say have been horribly inefficient and ineffective. Gloria, you said it best. What in the heck is material? And despite the Supreme Court saying we know it when we see it, this is harder for boards to decide when and if something cyber breach is material. And then once you do decide it is material, then to make disclosures that can be self-defeating and cause yourself more to be a target of bad actors, and also the plaintiff's bar, is very, very concerning. So I think the cyber rule will be significantly scaled back, but what priority that has is the question. I don't think we're going to see anything change here, certainly not for this, proxy season. Whether it changes for 2026, good question. I do think that's lower on the priority list. I think other priorities will be the human capital management rule proposals will not take effect. Those aren't going to come down the pike, I think. And Brianna would be interested to hear what your thoughts are on this. But I think the proxy advisor regulatory scheme will be reenacted as, I think, one of the higher priorities of the new commission. So, Brianna, I don't know what your views on that are.
Hey, Steve, could I ask you just a quick question on the human capital side? What about the disclosures that are currently being made that are principles-based, as opposed to more prescriptive ones that were sort of in the waiting pen?
So there's the new SEC is going to take a whole new view, maybe a step back view of what materiality is. And materiality is no longer going to be viewed by the commission as something that is in the greater good of society. It is going to be, does it have a financial impact on your stock price? Very plain and simple. Now, if you can say that those human capital management principles-based rules have that impact, then you should disclose them. If not, they're not going to be required to be disclosed by the SEC. Now, will institutional investors and the advisory firms, proxy advisory firms, have a different view? Maybe. But again, all this to me always comes down to stock price. I would just take an aside here to note that in your introductory remarks, Gloria, you said that PwC thought that perhaps one of the reasons for enhanced voting results was because of increased and better disclosure. It sounds like what SEC disclosure lawyers like me would tell our clients. Unfortunately, as many of you know, not many people at all read the proxy statements. Let's put it just plain and simple. However, what I do think is effective, other than stock price, is how you say things rather than what you say. And if what PwC is saying is, look, more graphics, more white space, more bullets, more easy takeaways is causing people to actually read more and understand more, I'm all in. If it's saying that, geez, because of new extensive disclosure rules, that's causing higher votes, that's hokum. It's just not happening. Not true.
I think that was their intention, having read some of the fine print, but you're right, it could easily be misconstrued. So, Stephen, I want to just ask you for some introductory thoughts about what we've just been talking about, sort of at the high level, and then take a step down into some sort of specific spaces.
Sure.
And I'm going to get to comp very shortly, and to Brianna, I can't wait to hear Glass Lewis's spin on all of this.
Well, thank you very much, and good morning to all, Gloria, and good morning to my panelists and those who are out in the audience. Look, those of us who've been around for a while, we've seen changes in regime. right? Changes in Washington, and we've seen the change go back and forth in the SEC. And I'm a securities lawyer too. I used to prepare documents. You prepare documents, and my wife, hey, you should read it because I wrote it. This 80-page disclosure document, and she would just throw it on the ground. People do read it, and I need, and particularly if you're, because I spent 10 years as an investor. And by the way, my good friends over at my competitor at PwC have done the same thing. They worked with me. So I think that's where they're coming from, understanding that investors wanted these changes. Investors have demanded to the SEC that they want apples to apples, and so they can do their measurement, because they don't have apples to apples in human capital management, and climate and other things. They want that. They're not going to get that from regulatory. And so when I talk to boards now, first of all, is that don't don't do your strategy based on regulatory. Regulatory is the basement, right? Think about what makes sense for your long-term total shareholder value and what your stakeholders want. Because the only natural enemy for a public company director is a shareholder. Shareholders vote on you every year. And so listening to them, and it doesn't mean that you have to go to the extreme. It's just understanding where you are. And that's where actually many companies are when it comes to DEI and other things, also with climate. So they're in. They're thinking about what makes sense, and they're defining their own materiality. They're also dealing with a regime, if they're a global company, in Europe and elsewhere, who have other rules that they must comply, and they have double materiality. So they're thinking through that. So I think at a high level, we're going to see lots of changes at the SEC. Whatever was in the first Trump administration SEC, that includes the proxy advisor, they're coming back with a quickness because they're already written. Now there's a lawsuit that they need to have cleared yet. They're not going to defend the lawsuit, but it's in the works on the proxy advisors, because the proxy advisors are pushing that lawsuit. So that's going to work itself out. So we will see that. There'll still be a debate on that, a legal debate, but we're going to see sort of a stripping of what materiality means from what the current SEC thought it would mean. But my advice to board members is always to think about very, very basic. Don't get into the weeds. That's management's idea. But how do we think about these issues, which sometimes show up on proxies? How does that affect our long-term value, and how does it affect our strategy, and make a decision from there?
Thanks, Stephen. That's a great overview, and put a pin in the thought for in just a little bit once we cover the SEC sort of with direct impacts. I want to talk about thinking about the right way to think about preparing the proxy narrative this coming season, as well as thinking about shareholder engagement in the very ways that you were talking about, listening and hearing, and you too, Steve, how you listen to investors, because I too think that they're the ones who got us to this point of robust disclosures over many years, along with the guidance from proxy advisors. So I want to cover a couple of things, and I just want to do this one really quickly because I think I know the answer. What's going to happen to board diversity, Steve? I'm coming back to you in terms of, we already know what happened to the NASDAQ SEC rule. We know, about the platform for DEI programs all being abolished in a new Trump administration. But do you think we're going to have, do you think we're going to see, and obviously we all remember what Robbie Starbuck did toward the end of the year, toward the end of the year to major companies to get them to quickly turn the page on DEI. So do you think we might actually get to the point of a limit on some sort of commission ruling around ESG, pro ESG climate and DEI shareholder proposals? I mean, that's pretty out there, but.
Well, I do think that what will happen is that they call it Staff Bulletin 14L. So everybody remember that, right? I'm just kidding. Staff Bulletin 14L changed the rules of the game when it came to ESG proposals, DEI proposals, things that oftentimes companies could exclude from their proxy statement because they were deemed to be ordinary business matters that could be excluded from proxy statements. 14L changed that so that the commission viewed, again, issues that were in the greater good, had broader societal impact, could not be excluded from proxy statements. That led to an explosion of ESG and DEI type of proposals that we've all seen over the past couple of years. That will go away. 14L will go away. So the business exception, the ordinary business exception, will come back into play. I think that will significantly reduce the number of ESG DEI proposals from shareholders on a go-forward basis. I think also everybody should be aware that Paul Atkins has been very clear on his views of these types of shareholder proposals. He calls them the tyranny of the minority. He would say, backed by some specific facts, that these types of proposals cost a lot of money. As an SEC lawyer, I'm not complaining, by the way, because a lot of that comes our way. But it's about $150,000 to $200,000 to respond to these types of proposals. With responsiveness, put them into your proxy statement, maybe go to the SEC, et cetera, right? Solicit your shareholders. He views those as being non-beneficial to value of companies. And so, and again, remember that along with Pierce and Ueda, who are all singularly minded on these topics, that's going to be the new viewpoint of the commission. So those types of proposals, geez, John Chevedden is the one person who's really going to hate this new environment, right? So that can't come too soon, by the way.
He's going to get a chance to comment on that.
If I could just, no, he won't. John Chevedden really focuses his shareholder proposals. John and his family members and there are a couple other so-called gadflies focus on the G part, right, and not the E and the S. And I think it's important to remember, one, I think going forward, we can't bunch E, S, and G. They are deeply separate. And that's the way we think about it. I absolutely agree with Steve about the staff bulletins will be changed. There's a different direction. I disagree that it's going to stop ESG, E and S proposals. They're up. Shareholders who have put them out they want to do this. They will continue. Whether or not they get rejected in the first level on a no action standpoint is another thing, or how much the current SEC didn't allow a lot of those, didn't take up many of those no action letters. And we're going to see that come back where they will provide exemption where warranted, but it's not going to stop the E and S proposals. Just not. That's not where shareholders are. And I wouldn't want companies to sort of fire the legal department and fire people like Steve and say, we don't need you anymore. Go to do labor or M&A because it's still going to matter, because it matters to shareholders. So I wouldn't want board members to take away that it's going to go away. Now, what I do think is that we have an opportunity, and what we'll see is that shareholder proposals, as they get written, as we go through time, shareholders get better and better at writing. We're actually seeing on the opposite side, the anti-ESG and the different programs that have started 3 or 4 years ago and writing those proposals, they're trying to get better and figure out what can get past the SEC and what maybe can get some votes. They have got, they only get single digits. They get better too. So my prospects that we're still going to see E and S proposal. We'll certainly see it in 2025, 2026. But you have a better chance of getting a no action letter going forward.
Well, I want to keep us moving, but it's great to get a little bit of a debate going on our panel, particularly around what is predictive on both counts. So let me move just really quickly before I get to comp issues, and then to Brianna. Do you just want to say a couple of words about enforcement policies going forward, Steve? Because again, I think that's another place where we're going to see sort of maybe a move back to more traditional approaches. And you could also mention, things like greenwashing, which has been important to the current SEC. And I know that it might be an appropriate moment before it gets lost in everything else to talk a little bit about the recent enforcement matter of Church and Dwight. And because I know you've been talking about that with your clients. So if we could go through that pretty quickly, it'd be great.
Sure. So from an SEC enforcement perspective, there will no longer be regulation by enforcement, right? This is the new SEC is going to be focused on real life retail investor, Main Street investor losses as their primary goal and mission. There will be less focus, maybe no focus, or maybe very little focus on corporate penalties as opposed to individual responsibility. I think you will see a much higher degree of due process, the so-called open jacket policy that Atkins and others on the commission believe in. So I think there will be a dramatic change in the types and kinds and level of enforcement activities. I do want to say something about Church and Dwight because this is a topic, and I'll describe it in a minute for those of you who don't know about this recent SEC enforcement case, that we are bringing to the attention of all of our boards for their upcoming meetings this February because it's important. Church and Dwight kind of shook all of us in the SEC bar because it basically said, look, if you have personal relationships between directors and executives, that could directly impact director independence. Now, the facts in Church and Dwight were egregious, right? As is almost every single case that creates new law. The facts matter. These were bad facts. Here was a situation where one of the directors took one of the executives on numerous international vacations, spent over $100,000. Was a mentor to this person trying to come up through the ranks as a new CEO candidate, and specifically said not to disclose these relationships to the board as they were considering director independence. That was the key fault in all of this, I believe. In any case, what this has created is a new focus on personal relationships between directors and executives. Where do you draw that line? Well, I think we all could try to figure it out. Maybe this is where you say, I know it when I see it, right? Normal social acquaintances, if you play golf every other week with the CEO, but you can't take them on vacation, right? I don't know where that line is drawn, but it's something the board needs to have the facts about to consider when they are making their evaluations of director independence.
Well, thank you for that. It's something that I'm not sure, as the director as I am on the Unum board, I've never thought about my fellow directors, and I am unaware of anything like this. But, when you're doing that annual disclosure of potential conflicts of interest, it's something that post this, I think everybody's going to have sort of a heightened awareness of the range of things that might need to be disclosed. So I'd love to move to you, Keith, and get some thoughts about the new philosophy, new SEC around comp issues, given the plethora of new comp-related disclosure rules that we've seen over the last 3 or 4 years. So I'm going to turn it over to you. Thanks for being here.
No, thank you for having us. I think consistent with what we've heard already, in terms of items that have not yet been put in force, such as the human capital metrics, they will not go forward. In terms of Dodd-Frank areas that are already in place, they're going to continue in the near term. For example, for PVP, we're not expecting any changes. Companies are now in their 3rd year of this. They're used to the rules, so we think they'll go forward. Now, the SEC will still continue to criticize mistakes. They're very complicated tables. We've seen some comment letters around not using the correct definition of GAAP net income in the table. But again, we expect these disclosures to continue as is. Again, similarly, clawbacks. They're well settled. Companies have adopted the Dodd-Frank clawback. We're not expecting any changes there. On the new stock option rules, companies have been, it's important to note, a lot of companies no longer have stock options. Our recent study showed that only 42% of S&P 500 companies now have options. That said, companies with options, they're careful now not to grant within the material non-public information windows. On the 10b5-1 new trading rules, companies have them. We're not given how complicated these new rules are, we're not expecting any increased prevalence on them. So I guess to summarize, what's in place will continue, but nothing new.
Wasn't the SEC looking for some expanded, more detailed explanations around PVP going forward? I mean, sort of, do you expect that things like that. Will they meddle around the edges now going forward about what's enough?
I think, I guess, right, there's two ways to explain your relationship in PvP, right? You have the narrative form and the graphs. We've seen more criticism for companies that have used the narrative, that there has been missing information, or it's not accurately expressing the relationship between compensation actually paid and performance. That's the majority of our companies, they're using the graphs. And in our opinion, the graphs do a good job of explaining that relationship. But yes, we still think around the edges, the SEC will, have their comment letters to companies that aren't fully in compliance. But, the safest way around that, again, is the graphs rather than the narrative explanation.
Well, that's really helpful. I want to get to one other thing because it's a hot topic, and that's that the existing SEC has frequently criticized common CEO perks like membership in gyms and using the corporate jets personally and housing allowances and things like that. But they've also had, the current SEC has also had on their list the review of executive use of personal and home security services. Dear God in heaven, I can't imagine that there's a company in the US that's not, hasn't been found the last available companies to provide those kinds of services. So this is something that's obviously changing. And I sort of wonder if the SEC will have, the wherewithal going forward, a different SEC to start being more careful in some ways, I guess more reflective about where these things can go, because obviously the murder of the CEO of United Health was jarring to not just healthcare companies, but to senior management at every company.
No, it's a very topical issue, and at a lot of high-profile companies, there's a lot of concerns around security, and there's a lot of discussions about ramping it up. For example, companies will talk about 24/7 personal security for executives. And that's expensive. And it might be that the SEC is going to have to come out with some, clarification. If you have 24/7 security, what portions, company business and what's personal? If you're working 18 hours a day, do you only count the 6 hours that you sleep as the personal security part? So I think the SEC is going to have to come with some clarification around that. There could be some companies that talk about family security. I mean, that may be necessary, right? Because unfortunately, there are the families could be a target instead of the executive themselves. And if the executive knows that their family is in jeopardy, they're going to be highly distracted. So the SEC may have to ultimately comment on whether the family type security is a business, cost. And so there's a lot. It's an evolving topic, as you might know. Our hope would be that if companies do a very good job in the CDNA of explaining the rationale for these increased costs, that proxy advisors and investors would be supportive of it and realize that it's a new cost of business. But a lot more to come on this.
And if I could just chime in on that, I mean, the SEC dealt with this about 20 years ago in terms of its disclosable perk, in Reg SK, so to be included within the amount above $10,000, your security. Before 2003, people thought you didn't need it, what have you. The SEC made it absolutely clear. And by the way, there are no details. People don't give details. And I think, and Brianna, we haven't heard from Brianna, and we will next. Shareholders are going to, they understand that. Shareholders can understand perks. The problem comes when they're not properly explained, and they pay for performance and sort of seeing the connection there. That's when shareholders get upset. But you're absolutely right to bring up that we might see an uptick in that particular, and they're called perks. Most CEOs will tell you, I've ever not had this type of constraint, which, by the way, they're told you will have this constraint. So they have to have it. But it does wind up in the proxy.
Thanks, Stephen. Okay, Brianna, I'm absolutely dying, and I know if I am, everybody else is too, to hear from you and Glass Lewis about your perspective. Obviously, we read your guidance last fall, your policy surveys, and then the changes in policy, voting policies for this proxy season. So give us sort of I think, a thumbnail sketch of that guidance, the buckets, the categories, as well as what you think the policy specific differences will be with the Trump SEC. And thank you for joining us.
Yes, thank you for having me. Good morning, everybody. Yes, first, perks, definitely something that we encourage disclosure on. If they're, higher than normal, I guess, is what we're calling the kind of new round. But definitely recommend enhanced disclosure around those. So in terms of our guidance, we didn't have as many changes this year as in prior years, but we did have a couple of notable ones that I wanted to highlight. So first, shareholder proposals, we had one major guidance update there, which is that we evaluate and make recommendations on all shareholder proposals regarding companies' use of AI on a case-by-case basis. And we generally think that companies should provide sufficient disclosure to allow shareholders to broadly understand how they're using AI in their operations and the ethical considerations, things like that. So related to that, in our US benchmark policy guidelines, we did add a new section on board oversight of AI. We, as Gloria mentioned, we did our policy survey and found that that was an area that was very important to most investor respondents. So we, said that boards should be aware and take steps to mitigate exposure to material risks that could arise from their use or development of AI. But we generally will not evaluate or make recommendations on that basis, except in instances where there is evidence that insufficient oversight and or management of AI technologies has materially impacted shareholder value. So that's what we're really, really focused on. Then for executive compensation proposals, the main guidance change there was a clearer description of our approach to assessing executive compensation programs. This is something, we've heard a lot from investors recently about the mix of time-based versus performance-based awards. We wanted to clarify there that few factors on their own, like that mix, result in an unfavorable recommendation without assessing the magnitude of a pay decision and its effect on a program's ability to align performance and the shareholder experience. So those are the main areas for our guidance. As for the second Trump administration, our policy and recommendations, they serve the best long-term financial interests of our clients. They don't serve a political purpose, and therefore we do not change it when the administration changes, and to try to match what we think their views might be. It is still early to know what changes may come, but we expect them to be more operationally related rather than policy or research related for us. And then I totally agree. It's going to it'll be determined by what the SEC's priorities are. The new administration, we think we've heard crypto is probably one of the big focuses early on, but in terms of proxy advice specifically, the SEC under the first Trump administration did create a set of rules for proxy advisors, and we know that those are still making their way through the courts. So, but that's kind of where we are with the SEC.
Well, you certainly answered one of my key questions, knowing it had been referenced earlier that all of that might come flooding back, and it, of course, could impact the top 3 institutional investors too, and how they operate. Do you think I know that you all have not been announcing in advance of the election, sort of the continuing politicalization around ESG. But I'm sort of wondering what you think, given ISS and BlackRock's sort of prominence in saying, this is what we think, meaning that things have become too politicized, and how that might impact sort of voting going forward and how people are thinking. And you seem to have steered clear of all of that in terms of, and I like how you framed it in terms of long-term success of companies, the long-term sustainability valuation of companies. So could you comment at all on that, sort of this potential additional, muddying of political waters around issues of importance to long-term thinking by companies?
Yeah, so, one thing we always look for, is the best. We evaluate shareholder proposals in terms of the long-term interests of shareholder value. So for ESG, we have seen companies that, we've seen all types of proposals. We've seen the anti, we've seen the pro. We expect to see more anti. So, those still are ESG proposals. So we expect those to continue, especially in 2025. But I think that the boards that focus on the financial materiality for ESG are the ones that will have a lot of success with the proxy narrative and things like that, with managing those various political groups or leanings. So that's what I would say.
Thank you. That's helpful. Okay, so I want to make a shift. It's hard to leave the SEC. What might happen, it kind of looms large, the proverbial elephant in the room. But I did want to move to sort of thinking broadly, and I don't want us to spend too much time on this because I want to get to specific topics, but about thinking about using the proxy statement and narrative, the graphs, the charts, the narrative, focusing on the risks, all of those things, but in a way that tells your story in this, highly divided, muddy waters that we're all currently in and have been in for a while, with a shifting political and regulatory environment, and think strategically. And I'd like to ask sort of a question first about the proxy itself and sort of where the thinking should be around, disclosures of key risks. Do you add things like AI, what you were just referencing, right in the proxy so that there's some clarity given the guidance that you were expressing, Brianna? Cyber, which isn't required to be there, but we've been talking for 2 years that it should be in these forums, and sort of the way that you can use this as an appropriate, with full disclosure shield, but also not as an invitation for attacks by these varying ends of the pole. So Steve, I'm kind of going to turn to you and ask you if you could just offer some comments about your thinking, because I know this is your advising clients every single day.
So I think to the point that you want to clarify in your proxy statement, which of your committees has oversight for cyber, AI, other specific risks? Absolutely. Do you clarify that in the charters for those committees that get posted to websites? Absolutely. Do you go any farther than that? Absolutely not. Right? I mean, in my view, once you set up the framework for oversight, going beyond that, I think, only creates additional liability risk for your board members, because lots and lots of circumstances are not easily pigeonholed into whatever your disclosure will be in your proxy statement. You're almost certain to fail. It's almost certain to become a point of contention with plaintiffs' firms and others that you didn't do what you promised you would do, and you told us shareholders you were going to do. So to me, that's why you elect boards with unique expertise and experiences to take each situation, as it may present itself, to exercise your oversight responsibilities and your fiduciary duty responsibilities, given those specific circumstances, but not with a broad brush. So that would be my view. From a disclosure standpoint, again, here I go back to more narrative, not really effective in my personal view. I think, the more creative you get with your graphics, your pictures, your charts, your bullet points, your white space, how can you actually have, and my view is people really don't read the proxy statement other than the advisory firms. How can you though actually, there you go, actually reach people who might pick it up and thumb through it, right? And to me, you have to make it easier for those people to read it, including your institutional investors who, by the way, don't read it either. So how do you actually communicate in those situations? Shareholder engagement, to me, that's where it's all about. I mean, much more important in my personal view than a proxy statement or a 10K. I think those outreaches are critically important to convey your strategy, your governance, framework, and your oversight, and to have a sharing of thoughts and ideas and what's really important to your top institutional shareholders.
So I think so you just merged two things that I very much did want to talk about, and I love how you covered that. Let me ask you a question about shareholder engagement. How far in these muddy waters do you go down the list? I can tell you at Unum, we're traditionally it was like top 5, 10, invite them in, have our board chair, board member to have the robust exchange, not a telling this is what we do, but an exchange of views,
Yep.
Which we've always found helpful. But this past year, we went further down the list. So there were some who had interesting points of disagreement with some traditional governance structure that we had, or something that we were doing with ESG. We wanted to talk it through with them. And it proved really helpful to us, but I don't know what you think with your broader, advisory capacity with other companies.
So it's a great question, and it's one that every board should ask itself and to evaluate. It's all very shareholder specific, right? Demographics. So what is your shareholder base and what does it look like? How many do your top 10, your top 20, what percentage of your shareholdings does that constitute? Do you want to get a differential mix of those as well? Kind of to your point, Gloria, do you want to get different thoughts and perspectives? I think here again, I will show my skepticism of these things. I think oftentimes these sound great. The directors, we're going to go for an outreach and we're going to have these great discussions with our major shareholders. And then I would say very frequently, or most directors or outreach, committees or chairmen who do that are very disappointed because at the end of the day, yes, those major institutional shareholders care about your strategy. They care about where your stock price is going and your valuation and how you're going to improve relatively near-term valuation. Beyond that, they trust you on governance, in my experience. I don't think they really probably know much about the specifics of your governance unless something bad has happened. Now,
we
Steve,
asked
you may have a different view of that, but I mean, that's my view.
We asked a couple last year that just said, no, we're happy. We may disagree with you this time.
And you're lucky to get
and
that,
you know what?
right?
No, we're always happy. They can always turn us down, Steve. That's
right.
That's perfectly fine. Stephen, would you add a couple of points to this?
Well, sure, absolutely. And actually, I'm gonna, if you don't mind, I'm gonna refute some of them because I don't think the proxy today in 2025 is it speaks to many different constituencies. And again, for people, a proxy is a board document. It is a board document, it tells the board story. Boards sit for election, and those who don't sit for election every year may have a particular view that it's only speaking to constituency of regulatory, but in Corp Fin, who are the ones doing the checking, but it speaks to your employees. Employees read that proxy, particularly how much people get paid. Employees read it. Shareholders read it. I was a shareholder for a top 5 company, investor, $1 trillion asset manager. We read it. Not only did we read it, but today with different AI systems, it can within seconds break down information. And that's what's being done now. Breaking down that information and getting to the root cause, which may have taken 2 hours, can get it in 30 seconds. So I would remind board directors that shareholders are reading it and they have processes inside of investment firms that are using AI to break down to get the information. And so you should think, so when it comes to, should you go beyond what is regulatory required, you go to where you think you need to go with your communications team, your securities lawyers and others, and your IR team that makes sense for telling your story. Because if you don't tell your story there, by the way, that's why shareholders want engagement. They want an independent director, to meet and sort of see the whites of their eyes and ask questions. Typically, it's around comp. It won't be around issues that are already in the proxy because they read that already. Now, I had a director say, "No, I had a meeting. They never asked me about this and that." I said, "They have that information. They're asking you about what's not there." And often they find that there are things that are very helpful that are within Reg FD that haven't been in there. And they say, "Well, why aren't you in there?" Those companies have been very successful over the years and putting that stuff in the proxy do a very good job in explaining engagement. So now you have a section of the proxy, which is a best practice, that tells about the engagement which they've done throughout the year. Here's, we spoke to this many investors and they said all these different things. No, here's what we've done, or here's what we have not done, and here's why. They explain those things. So the more that you can explain it, that's what your investors want. And in terms of who you should meet with, obviously you got to meet with those who are important and large, and those who are noisy. One corporation, which I know does a very good job, they meet with their top 10. They also meet with someone who may be well down in the ranks, but are noisy. When I say noisy, they're the people who will file a proposal. They're the people who have something going. And shareholders do talk to each other. And it doesn't cost you all that much to have an ear and have someone who really takes the time. And I'm saying the director, someone who really takes the time to understand where those shareholders are.
Thanks, Stephen. I appreciate that. That's what we were trying to do a year ago, and it feels like it was helpful. So, Brianna, I want to go back to this, but I want to loop in because I want to loop in the enhanced scrutiny on boards themselves for their accountability and responsibility, as well as individual directors. And I learned a lesson a long time ago on a bank board from ISS, to mention the other crew, that why were they ranking us, 5 versus a 4, 3, 2, 1, whatever. Well, we couldn't find the information. And this sort of goes to the ability for you to be able to know because of and Steve, you said this really well in terms of going less narrative, more, shiny pictures and graphs that can tell the story. And I'm sort of, in those graphs that you can immediately grab the data you're looking for. And I sort of wonder if you could apply sort of this thinking broadly to proxy, shareholder engagement, then a company engagement, as well as this enhanced every year. And it looks like it's just going to continue scrutiny of, well, who's in charge? It's ultimately the board and individual directors.
Yeah, so we have seen a larger focus on that year over year. What we have found, I did see a note in the chat as well. MasterCard, Caterpillar, Occidental Petroleum, Chegg. Those are a few of the ones that we kind of pick out. Oh, that's a good chart, or that's really helpful information there. So just a few to name off the top of my head. One thing that we found particularly helpful, particularly useful information for boards to think about including in their proxy is how their director's background and experience led to particular skills. So this is, director qualifications. Investors typically want to see a good mix of skills. That's where the skills matrix becomes really helpful, but the skills matrix doesn't always tell you like, okay, well, why did you pick that? Why did you put that check mark there? Like, how did they get that expertise? So the Caterpillar in particular had a good way of putting in the director qualifications. You see, here's the, and I've seen similar ones where you state, these are the kind of areas of expertise, these are the skills, and then how did they gain that experience? So for example, finance and accounting, risk management, gained while serving as head of global manufacturing and services at Merrill Lynch, things like that. Information on ongoing director training and education in particular areas is also very helpful. And, we do expect to see more scrutiny on those kinds of things. Like, there are a limited number of AI experts to go around for boards. So, you might have to do some director training so that you can get that expertise on the board. So those are really helpful kind of things to think about including in proxy statements.
So it's more
And-
important. I just think that's really where I was headed. Is it more important for you to see how these skill sets and experiences blend together to make an effective board? And you need each of the pieces to fit and be appropriate. Maybe they've been on too long. Maybe there are other reasons why their experience doesn't seem to fit. I mean, those are the kinds of things. If you have both the profiles and the matrices, then you get a much better way of integrating it into a whole picture. And I think that's really helpful. I think we probably need to move on. I'm going to ask Ellen before we move into some specific areas, and I do want to return to comp, Keith, but then I want to really get into some of the more difficult areas like ESG and board diversity and some of those things. And given our time constraints today, it's not a full day forum, but I want to get to some of these, and I absolutely want to get to activism, which sometimes I don't want that to be the one that gets left without time. So, Ellen, is there anything sort of pertaining to what we've done that really should get answered now?
Yeah, there are three questions, and I'll give you all three. One is to Brianna, which is, can you please clarify whether your change in executive comp means that Glass Lewis now accepts situation of long-term grants without performance benchmarks? I know that's somebody put that in, and it's a great question from a practical standpoint. Then for Keith, there's a question on executive comp. With the SEC's recent focus on executive comp recovery and enhanced disclosure requirements, how should boards proactively address changes in comp policies to ensure alignment with regulatory expectations, but more importantly, shareholder interests? Okay, and then the last one, I would say, goes to Steve, and without going all the way back, it basically comes back to the fact that no matter what we think is going to happen in the US, most of our companies are large global companies, and we are working under regulatory requirements in the EU and other places. And, despite what the US may or may not be doing, companies have to deal with regulations, for example, in the CSRD in Europe. And can you speak to that? So I'd start with Brianna, go to Keith, and then go back to Steve. And
Absolutely.
those are the three big ones.
Our lightning round. Brianna.
Yes. So basically, it doesn't necessarily mean that we now accept situations of long-term grants. It's a holistic approach. So it's really intended to clarify that no one factor, so the absence of performance benchmarks, would result in an unfavorable recommendation. What we want to see is disclosure around why that might make sense for your company. So there are definitely companies that have, long-term grants focused on time-based awards that we do support. It's really about how you explain how that is the best pay program for your company.
Thank you. That's great. Keith.
Thanks, Ellen. And I think what I heard from the question is, what are, some best practices around compensation recovery or compensation recruitment? At this point, as I mentioned earlier, the Dodd-Frank clawback policy is, well in place. That said, a lot of companies have gone beyond Dodd-Frank. As a best practice, many companies today have what we'll call bad behavior clawback triggers. I mean, we think boards want recourse when there are situations where executive actions cause significant reputational harm. And we encourage our companies to have those discussions and to put those clawbacks in place. They're usually on a discretionary basis where the board can, make their own decision as to what would be appropriate to claw back.
Steve.
So no question, if you have applicable laws and regulations of different countries' jurisdictions, you have to comply with them, right? No one's saying that you don't. You do. How you do it, where you disclose it, I mean, I think that's all the question we're talking about. What is generally driving proxy statements, 10Ks, are the rules and regulations of the SEC, your stock markets, and the proxy advisory firms and your institutional shareholders. So, you have to balance those. Where are you gonna reflect your compliance with the laws of other countries? I leave that to you and your counsel to determine where's the best place to do it, but no one's saying you shouldn't comply.
Thank you. Thanks, all three. And Keith, I now want to move on to some specific issues and wanted to ask you in particular if there's some comp things we should be aware of with shareholder proposals and thinking as we move into this season that we didn't talk about as they relate to the new SEC.
Sure. In terms of comp proposals, the Chevrons and the others, they're still gonna get lobbed in. We don't see any slowdown in them. That said, in terms of these proposals, we think they will continue to get low support. And companies in our view, have good programs in place when they get these typical proposals. For example, on severance, in our view, most companies have very reasonable severance programs at the named executive officer level. We typically don't view them as egregious. For example, for a CEO, 1.5 salary and target bonus as a severance is, in our view, for an involuntary severance, reasonable. So again, they're gonna continue to get lobbed in, but we think low support, and we think companies can stand behind the programs that they have in place on these issues.
If I could ask you another question, what is your thinking as we go forward about the anti-ESG proposals attacking the inclusion of ESG goals and executive performance targets?
Yeah.
Clearly, lots of companies have moved to do that, especially larger companies. I would be interested in your perspective since that's an area of just obvious pushback.
No, it is, and perhaps those proposals in 25, may get a slightly higher level of support. Hard to predict on that. From a compensation standpoint, what we've observed from companies over the last year or so, particularly in light of the Supreme Court ruling in the Harvard admissions case, a lot of companies, to avoid lawsuits, have moved away from the quantitative representation type goals, just as they don't want the lawsuits. That said, from a compensation standpoint, at least, we do see companies continue to use ESG related metrics. They've somewhat evolved towards the employee inclusion or belonging type metrics, often on a qualitative basis, in annual incentive plan scorecards, not a large weighting, 5%, 10%. For example, improvement in employee engagement scores or actions taking in response to areas identified from an employee engagement survey. So we think those types of metrics will continue in plans.
Thanks. I want to move to board diversity because some interesting things are happening there. There's been such a push for it, starting with gender and obviously more broadly since then over the last decade. Today, half of directors on S&P 500 boards are considered diverse, literally 50%. Russell 3000 have passed the 30% mark on gender, but the pace of growth for both board diversity and CEO diversity has actually stalled a bit in recent years. So wanted to sort of start to pierce that veil just briefly and talk about, again, we know you referenced the Harvard case, Supreme Court case. We've got the rejection of new California laws and the NASDAQ rule on diversity, more conservative SEC. But at the same time, institutional investors probably thought this was already accomplished. They were early on the scene. Same thing with proxy advisors, making this highly relevant to companies. But of course, many companies continue to support increased and even further the expansion of diversity. So it just feels like maybe a pause moment to think more broadly and then more concretely about your own company and exactly what you need, but also with an eye to the perspectives of your shareholders and the proxy advisors who represent them. So Brianna, I think I'm going to ask you about this. Because it's, again, an area of importance across a variety of stakeholders, you included, but there's some pushback.
Yeah, so I think it's something that continues to be important to a lot of shareholders. I think that companies that we probably will see more shareholder proposals on this type around diversity and rescinded people that companies that have rescinded their DEA related goals will probably have to face proposals on this topics. It's hard to say exactly what's going to happen. It's probably the first thing we'll see, as Keith said, is kind of pulling back on the disclosure, but it's definitely something that remains important, and especially for global shareholders, for European investors, especially. So we expect there to still be a focus on it, but yeah, not sure. I mean, in terms of board composition, investors typically like to see a mix. So I expect that they'll continue to favor a diverse range of directors on boards.
And do you think that, I mean, this is another juncture where you could say that for boards, it's important that you explain your rationale for what you're doing. And without going into too much detail, Steve, or over detail, but just sharing that, look, we think, as some many surveys have shown,
right,
we think broader perspective is good for us. It adds culturally to the boardroom dynamic. We think there's better decision-making. Whether it enhances company value overall is a totally separate considerations. And many boards don't think that's even their rationale for doing it. So is that fair? I mean, do you think that that's sort of where we can divide this?
Well, if you don't mind, if I can jump on that.
Sure. Sorry, Brianna.
I know.
Oh,
I didn't
yeah, it's for you, Brianna, but I was going to jump in because I thought you were passing. You were punting, but go ahead.
I just want to see if that's sort of the focus of, this is, they've got a rationale. Their disclosure explains what they're doing. You get high fives from investors, your institutional investors and others, for having done what they told you to do 10 years ago. And I don't think if you've explained your rationale in terms of the company itself and what the goals are, the rationale, it just feels helpful.
Yes, we typically, we encourage disclosure. We want to see the decision making, diversity. For it's diversity of thought that people are really after, and for the gender diversity, other types of diversity have been kind of representative of diversity of thought. So that's I think that people it's still important to them, and so they're still going to want to see narrative around those type of decisions.
It's a great way to introduce it because it can get you to even broader forms of diversity. And I think culturally and otherwise, giving those experiential differences that you can bring to the table. So I would like to now move to the ESG matters and sort of where are we going forward with this. Obviously, I'm glad we've already said California's new climate disclosure rule, the CSRD for companies, global companies, of which there are many. I don't know what overall percentage of public companies are regulated by one or both, but there are hefty numbers falling into each, and obviously combined numbers too. And obviously they'll, as you've said, Steve, will continue to comply with what they need to. But sort of where are we with companies that maybe have waited to see what's happening to the climate rule at the SEC. When we think about disclosures and maybe not have, the level of reporting right now that involves the assurances, the metrics that have been checked multiple times, and particularly when you're looking at GHG and other climate specific risks, it feels like there are a group of companies that have more standardized metrics than we did, even 5 years ago, that they better understand what the investors want, Brianna, from that. But sort of as we go into this season, sort of where are those companies that may have been hedging their bets for a bit and sort of in some industry sectors? And maybe I'll go to the two Steves about this and sort of what you're advising clients. We know the ones who have compliance obligations will continue to meet them as best as they can. But what about those that are sort of still out there, of which there are companies, particularly on something as complex as climate? And then we can get to DEI in a minute.
I want to have Stephen
Yeah.
go first so I can disagree with him.
Okay.
Oh, sure.
It is fun watching you two spar.
Well, listen, well, one, it's fun to spar, but two, it's also just simply, you can. What's important is to have a conversation about how to think about it, and I think where Steve comes from, I'm guessing, and Steve will tell you if I'm wrong. I'm a lawyer too, but I also am an investor. I'm a professor, and I think with both minds. There's a little bit of schizophrenia going there, and so I don't simply think liability, because I think there's a role. I mean, that's why you have lawyers. The lawyers in the room to say, "Hey, don't do that," or to push that. And then the idea is to push back a little bit, and then get to a point where we're making sure that we're doing something that's not going to get us into legal trouble. But we understand the risk. And I'm asked by board members all the time, so what should we do to manage our different stakeholders? And I look directly up the board and say, that's literally your job as a board member. Now, is to take the appropriate risks. And most of the time, you better hope that you win. Sometimes you lose, but that's business. If you don't take risks, you're going to be average, and you want to be a little bit more than average. So I think what we'll see is where we've always been, which is that we have multiple regimes. You're going to have, if you're a global company dealing in Europe, you're going to have disclosure and reporting that deals with Europe. By the way, if you do business in California, you're going to have that unless that gets overturned. But from the board standpoint, I always think about, don't let regulatory run your strategy, right? Because regulatory is the floor. That's the base. And to think about what makes sense for you. And by talking to your different stakeholders, including your employees, and I think the employees are your biggest stakeholders that you have. Employees can decide to come in to work or not, particularly today. Employees also, we saw this in Amazon 3 years ago, where employees sort of responded to a shareholder proposal and then actually did their own shareholder proposal. So they become a little bit more active. And so it's a brave new world for directors. And again, for directors to really keep looking at the 35,000 foot level, but what makes sense for them to make decisions. The big issue for directors, I think, going forward around this climate issue is, because you're not going to have reporting obligations necessarily in the United States, and we're going to see in Europe where you're going to start to see a little pushback from European companies. And the reason is, quite frankly, because you haven't seen that pushback, but the reason you're going to see it is that they've been waiting for the U.S. to have regulatory reporting. U.S. won't have it. So they're going to push back on their own regulators. Why do I have to be at a disadvantage to do that if they don't have to do that? We also saw in the United States, our Senate, happened to be mainly Republicans, so write letters to the European Union. Actually went to our own Treasury Secretary, but it was about the European Union and their rules, saying those rules are awful. Why do we have to comply with them? And it's unfair, regardless of the fact that it's like their jurisdiction and you actually have no power about how they regulate their jurisdiction. But it was sort of a pushback that we don't want to comply with those either. So it's going to be an interesting push to sort of watch. And so there's a regulatory play, A, but B, for the board, and I keep stressing this over again, is thinking about what makes sense for you. And I think we have a lot of folks who, for the last 3 years, it's been reporting that we sort of got blinded about what the big picture is, right? Because I can't tell you what a GHG is or how to count one of those. I know it's important, don't know how to count it. Someone does know how, they'll figure it out. But strategically, I can understand about what makes sense for me to do. And I think, and again, we put so much on corporations to do the work of what we think as a society government should do. And that we're still going to be waiting for governments to do whatever they think is important for the community, and less about the private ordering for companies.
Oh, I
So
think
hopefully I
that's,
said enough, Steve, where you could possibly
I
disagree.
saw him shaking his head in a
No.
positive way. So
I,
All right.
I just want to shock everybody. I totally agree with Steve here. I think that's absolutely right.
I think that was really helpful. Can we now, Steve, can I now move to you on DEI? Because I definitely want to take a look at this, because talk about a crazy quilt, because you have these social media mavens on the outside, like Robbie Starbucks and copycats. And you've got the inside players who are saying no to this stuff. It's gone forward. Now you have a Trump administration. It's not just be the SEC talking about it for companies. It's going to be everyone in the administration drop all DEI initiatives. So sort of where does this put the companies who have been responding to investors for a long time in this area, as well as proxy advisors, because they've been, whatever percentage of the cases believe in it themselves, that they do better with perspective that is diverse at every level of the company. Brianna, sort of where you were going with this. So Steve, what are you telling companies? Because this is kind of the Wild West part of it. It's not the metrics piece that is so much more defined on the Enviro side. And this one, and then what happened with Robbie? I mean, what big bucks retail giant isn't scared of Robbie Starbucks coming in with the alleged customer base? Steve.
So let me talk about Robbie Starbuck first, because I think every board should be thinking about whether or not they are a potential target for Robbie. Mostly these are companies that have retail customer bases, that people may view their retail customer bases as being rural or conservative or so-called anti-woke. Those are those types of companies. If you're on one of those boards, you're most at risk at, right? And if you don't know who Robbie Starbuck is, he picks out companies like Harley Davidson and John Deere and Tractor Supply Company that I think kind of fit the scenario I just described for you. And he goes on a social media campaign that highlights the fact that these companies with, highly rural, conservative, anti-woke customer bases are actually having DEI programs and focus that are incongruent with their consumer base, their customer base. And he's been extraordinarily effective at changing some major corporations' view on their DEI programs. Now, so I do think if you fit that, you have to be prepared for him. And in particular, where Robbie has been, very effective, unfortunately, is looking at the social media accounts of directors on those boards. And to the extent he views them as being woke or supportive of woke type ideas, he has personally attacked those directors. So many companies are saying, okay, if we are going to, prepare ourselves, be anti-Robbie, we need to make sure that we're not having our directors become targets themselves. And so there may be some, reviews of social media accounts by your directors, which some directors find offensive. For obvious reasons. So, but that's a discussion that if you fit that category, you should have, because trying to respond in the hot, red spotlight of a Robbie Bucks campaign is not a good idea from a corporate governance standpoint. So you should be prepared in advance.
I think you just summed up the whole Wild West arena, because now it's external to the proxy season and also directly applied internally. And we could talk, if we had more time, which unfortunately we don't, we could talk about rebranding. I watched this, as we all did, with sustainability reporting, where it had been your ESG report, but now it's your sustainability report. There is a way to rethink how, particularly if you've embedded this. To me, I think climate, broader environmental impacts DEI. This is talking about making sure that it's fundamental if you believe that these are the right things for your company, sort of is a ribbon that runs through the baseline of your company. These are not these set aside efforts. And that's what's kind of, it feels like performative behavior by some companies has kind of gotten them into trouble. But we'll see what happens this year. So I want to really quickly move to a couple of things and leave at least 2 minutes to say something about activism, because it is more and more active than ever. And going into next year, it's going to be more so. But I did want to ask you, Brianna, to say a few more things about what you think adequacy around AI disclosures should mean. I think it's such an important area because it's just moving at, hyper speed. So, investors, there were only a few proposals last year, but this year could be very different just because so many companies now have embraced it in ways, but are still wrangling with the right approaches to governance.
Yeah, so we found, AI is the biggest evolving area of risk and governance currently. We actually, conducted our survey, and we found that 2/3 of investor respondents expected clear disclosure of the board's oversight of AI governance. So that is, key thing to consider. We also asked about the importance of certain components of a company's risk and AI risk oversight and ethics. And we found that the most important component to investors was data security and privacy related vulnerabilities. So the cybersecurity tie-in, 83.5% consider it to be very important. Next was social and ethical issues and potential for reputational harm. That was 72%. And then, getting into still supported by a majority, but disclosure on integration into products and services, director expertise and ongoing education and training for directors. Those are also very important to a majority of investor respondents. So yeah, it's definitely an evolving area, and it's kind of, since it's so new, I don't really have things that are typical that we've seen, but those are the things that when we asked investors, those were the things that they highlighted for AI disclosure.
Well, I would highly recommend that our audience go back and grab a copy of that list, because they all sound like the components that should be considered as part of your overall thinking. We don't really have, governance proposals were the ones that actually won the day last year. I did want to ask, there was one governance proposal or one area that somebody in chat was asking about, which I find interesting too, is what sort of happened with this idea of an independent chair, kind of dropping support for that dropping. Steve, I see you nodding your head.
So I don't think this has ever been that big of an issue to shareholders who really care about corporate performance and stock price. It is a check the box type of a situation that some shareholders have made a big issue about. I think again, and Brianna, you can weigh in here because I think you're on board with this. I think it's a case by case determination. It depends, what your, culture has been, your long-term board structure has been. Is it a new CEO who's just come into the chair? Is it someone who's been in the chair for 20 years? All of those, the structure of your board leadership are, individual to your company, along with, if you do have a combined CEO chair, do you have a strong lead director, which is obviously the way to address all these situations. So in my view, if it goes, I never have thought it was that important one way or the other. It was all cultural, and it was up to a board to decide how they wanted to be led. And as long as they were doing a good job and the stock price was going up and they didn't have a governance failure, then why are we messing with something that's working? In my view.
So before we go at the end, we always ask for, top 3 takeaways in a 1 minute, for each of you. And we sort of run at the end of the clock. But I do want to ask just for a minute or two about activism, because obviously we saw record-breaking numbers that particularly were sort of part of the last 6 months and the last quarter of 24. But you've got longtime activists. They go public more now. Newcomers pushing in, record number of cases involving pushing out CEOs. And now you're going to have a more activist, I'll say boldly, as well as MA, deal making, more interest in, less restrictive than than Justice and the Federal Trade Commission have been on M&A activity. So does somebody, it's kind of a jump ball. If you want to say something, okay, Stephen, you got it.
Very quick, yeah, and activism we've seen blossom. We first started in the 80s, and then we saw, and from 2010-12, really take off. And now you have people who've done so very well in those funds create their own funds. So you have lots of them who are out there. It's all about the environment. Think about it for board members in two parts. One is what's the value argument of the activists, and then think about the campaign. Can they win? And they think about the value argument, when there's performances down, there are things that are going wrong at the company, there are directors that they think they can go after, and they think about the campaign to win because they got to get 50.1%, and it really relies on institutional investors. And sometimes the institutional investors have told them, and it's in the chat, someone that talked about a campaign, and they ask for activists to come in. By the way, board members, under plenty of research that's been done, we've done the research, Stanford has done it, that board members say, more than half of them, that there's someone sitting on my board who shouldn't be there. Well, the activists say, we know that, we understand that, there's probably 3 of them that shouldn't be there. We're going to tell you who the 3 are, and we're going after you. And so I think we're going to see the environment is going to be rich for it, going for it. We've seen already, we're in the middle of January, we've already seen it, and it should be interesting going forward.
Oh, thank you. That's really helpful. And I'm glad you made the point about it's really the universal proxy, right? It's just open the door to very much.
It has, but also, I mean, big time activists would say they would prefer not having you as a proxy. We can go into why that is, but it does open the door for an activist, a smaller activist, who wouldn't have to spend that money to do that.
And also the focus on an individual director or two. But by the way, they're not winning all the seats in proxy fights. It's just coming in settlement, dribs and drabs. So, but so to that point, it's just an area that really watch this, and obviously with sort of a more robust opportunity in the markets to M&A activity, sort of this pent up thing. Now it's going to be that could pop. So could I get you to give literally 1 minute or less, because we're running up against the deadline, 1 minute or less, sort of a couple, maybe 2 takeaways that you think are most important from your perspective for Proxy Season 25. Steve, sorry.
Well, let me say something that you didn't ask me to say. And I do want to weigh in on this activism because I do think it should be on every board's agenda at least once a year and maybe twice a year. And that is actually doing advanced planning for a potential activist approach and or attack. There should be game planning. There should be a desktop exercise. There should be actual running of scenarios that you think are most likely for an activist to propose. Do you, should you, spin off something? Should you increase your dividend? Should you refocus your business? I mean, all of those things, which good boards do, right? This is part of your strategic analysis. You should be doing all that work so that you have the answers to what you think as a board could be the most likely areas of activist approach. Yes, good, great suggestion, shareholder, but we have looked at spinning off XYZ division, and here's why we think it doesn't work and it hurts shareholder price. Do that work.
That's a fabulous takeaway, and it was something we should have gotten to, and I'm so glad you said that. Okay, Stephen.
3 things quickly. 1, your proxy is a communication device to several different parts of stakeholders, from the employees to the investors to, of course, regulatory. Don't let regulation run your strategy. Don't let regulation run your strategies. Take away there. Think about ESG and its separate components. By the way, if a shareholder proposal isn't environmental, social, governance, I'm not sure what letter you could. They're all ESG, but you got to think about it separately. Larger discussion there. And lastly, now, where you stand on an issue, where you stand on a corporate governance issue depends where you sit many times, and where you sit and where you get hit. It really depends. And what I mean by that is that corporate governance in the United States really is affected by what happens in current events. No, events trigger outrage by the public, triggers politicians to legislate, triggers SEC to do something because politicians have told them to do it, triggers private ordering about what boards are doing. And where we are today, when we think about what we're going through in California and other places, these events will push, and although we don't have a climate law, are going to push, I believe, some of these things. Other events that happen in life sort of push things that are in the E and the S space. And so that is what boards have to understand. What happens in the world has an effect. And it ultimately comes down to what people believe the responsibilities are of business to respond to it.
Thank you. Brianna, so great to have you here, a proxy advisor. We should never do a program without you.
Thank you for having us. And yes, I'm happy to join any and all. 3 areas to remember: board skills and director qualifications. So as I said, how, investors want to see a good mix. They're wanting to see, how did you get those skills? What experience led to those types of things? AI and AI oversight disclosure. So oversight of AI, really important. The components, once again, to investors with data security and privacy related vulnerabilities, and disclosure on social and ethical issues and potential for reputational harm. So if you're thinking about enhancing your AI disclosure, those are the key ones that I would kind of think about. And then lastly, I would emphasize the importance of financial materiality for ESG issues, as we think, those are the companies that focus on that, we think will do the best in navigating this divisive issue.
Those are perfect. Keith, our closer.
Just in the interest of time, I'll just mention one item. Recently in ISS's new 2025 policy, they did note that they're going to take a closer look at performance-based equity plans for companies that score high on the quantitative test. So that involves, did you clearly disclose the payout for the cycle ending this year? Are forward-looking goals disclosed, which a lot of companies do not do that for competitive harm reasons. Clear rationale for metrics. So just something to be aware of in 2025.
Thank you all so much. I'm going to send it back, Melissa, I think.
Actually, I'm jumping in.
Beth,
thank you.
yay.
Hi, Gloria. Thank you so much to our panel. That was fantastic. So much content in such a short period. I think we all got the PhD program right there in 90 minutes. Couple of closing things. I'm Beth Boland. I chair the New England chapter, but I'm also Steve Barth's partner and proud to be at Foley and Lardner. 2 things. I want to emphasize doing the survey. The link has been sent to you here in the chat, but you also get it by email. We had 182 people at the height of the program. We expect 182 surveys coming back. We really do listen to them and formulate our programs around them. I also want to give everybody a heads up on a couple of upcoming programs, not only with the New England chapter, but the Philadelphia chapter as well. I think we have a slide on that, if we can put that up. Here we go. For the New England chapter, we want to alert you to our January 29th and February 6th programs on board oversight and climate and sustainability. For the Philadelphia chapter on January 22nd, technology leadership in the boardroom, and February 6th, a virtual coffee break. And also to highlight for this group 2 very special programs that New England is going to be putting on in person, one for aspiring directors on April 16th, and the other for experienced directors on June 10th. These are all-day programs. We will not only address many of the issues that you've heard today, but also soup to nuts. You go from 8 o'clock in the morning till 5 o'clock in the afternoon. You need to sign up early because space is limited, especially for the experienced director program in Boston in June. So keep an eye out for that. And we hope to see you all at these fantastic upcoming programs. And thank you all for coming today.